Nuriyah Khan, welcome to Thinking Class. Thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks so much for having me.
Nuriyah, you have made a name for yourself in one of the many dark corners of the internet, which people like you and I are inhabiting increasingly these days. You're an ex-Muslim. You speak out about women's rights issues and human rights more broadly. And indeed, the issues that you face as an ex-Muslim and the response to you from at least certain fellow Muslims or your ex-fellow Muslims. I think it's fair to say there's been somewhat of a furore in Britain recently. We've had the beginning of Ramadan, and some of our most prestigious institutions, and indeed the heads of those institutions, have opened the doors to Muslims to celebrate Ramadan and breaking iftar. This includes our King, Charles III. He opened up Windsor Castle and the Great Hall in there for an iftar. And indeed, Keir Starmer and his cabinet did so in the halls in Parliament. And I believe Canterbury Cathedral has done the last couple of years too. Commentary on this suggests it's a big issue on some sections of the commentariat, and others say, well, this is an issue. This is just about being kind and welcoming. What's your take on all of this?
I wouldn't have too much of an issue if it was about being kind of kind and accommodating. And this was something that we saw across the board. But increasingly, what I've seen around me, especially, and given, institutions in London and across the country, as you mentioned, as far as you said, the King himself, and the Mayor of London, with the Ramadan lights, for example, for the last couple of years, there seems to be more and more of a spotlight on Islam, Islamic practices, Islamic celebrations, and, the general English society having to kind of cater to and accommodate that across the board. So it was, even with the whole, King Charles setting out dates and packaging iftar packages, I thought, let me just hold fire on this one, because I'm assuming the same thing would be happening for Lent coming up and Easter. And, let's just not kind of, jump down that rabbit hole straight away. But it turns out that it is just a heavily kind of Islamic pandering that we see happening more and more. So obviously he didn't really do anything for Lent. And I saw people arguing that, well, fair enough. He's never usually come out and said anything about Lent in the past. So I thought, okay, fair enough. Let those sleeping lions lay. But I think a lot of this has to do with just how captured the society is, and the wider society, in terms of our institutions, when it comes to Islam. And there is no kind of easing of this. If this was the same treatment that we saw for Hindus celebrating Holi or Diwali, or things like that, or we saw the same things for like Hanukkah or Passover, it would be a bit more, the fact that society and these religions are given kind of equal prevalence. But there seems to be this complete bending over backwards to accommodate Islam. And it's even when it comes to politicians in power, they seem to be the loudest minority at the moment. So it is a worrying trend. And that's why I did comment on it on my channel itself, because I thought, if the royal family are going to stand behind Islam in this manner, then we expect them to stand for all faiths. And I do understand that King Charles himself had said that he didn't want to be seen as the defender of the faith, but the defender of all faiths, which made me think even more that this was something, he would apply in equal measure. But unfortunately, it is Islam that we're seeing kind of be given the loudest backing.
King Charles is, I think, known for his quite nuanced and complex philosophical worldview. I think he's what you call a perennialist, someone who sees that all of the major religions contain some sort of transcendental truth, and there's some overlap there. I think it's probably fair to say, however, that adherents to any of those religions and the common person who hasn't necessarily had the same formation as our king probably don't see things that way when it comes to advancing the interests of their religion or being concerned about it or its supremacy. And I suppose this goes for any of them. And I don't want to make you a kind of a newly appointed spokesperson for a lot of people you don't know, and indeed people who are not even your fellow religionists these days. However, you probably have more of an insight into the mind of someone who understands the culture of Islam. What would you say the common person, a common Muslim, might be thinking about the institutional changes that we're seeing within Britain that are seemingly leaning in favour toward Islam? Do you think that people will be welcoming of it? Do you think they will think Britain's bending over backwards too much? Will there be some who think that here comes a great victory, or is it more an ambivalence? Is this being led more by institutions than the people? What do you think's driving all of this?
I think the nature of Islam itself, so whether you're a kind of, let's just say, nominal Muslim or a non-practicing Muslim, the fact that you are part of this greater Islamic religion, you are part of the Ummah, so to speak, which is, the actual Islamic, I guess, sorry to bring this up so early, but because Islam is so also political in its nature and it sees everything else outside of it as the other. So, like, regardless of how entrenched you are within the fold of Islam and how practicing you are or not, every tiny kind of step you would see. So if you see the king on TV packaging dates, whether you're a heavily practicing Muslim or just kind of say, I believe in Allah, and, in my heart personally, you would celebrate that as a small win, in my humble opinion, because it is still at some level having your religion being recognized in the mainstream. And I hate to say it as well, but you're seeing your religion being recognized in the heart of a Western democracy, essentially. And that can not be anything but a win for a properly practicing, believing Muslim, and in the greater sense for Islam itself. So I think that every time, whether it's, institutionally sanctioned or just the general act of kindness, or trying to, a random Muslim in the street, letting it be known that he's fasting or she's fasting, and somebody needs to kind of accommodate them, that for them, each time that accommodation is made, they will see that as a win. Because on the flip side, for example, when you look at the Middle East, and I spent a lot of time in Saudi Arabia and Dubai, where I grew up, there was no concessions made for non-Muslims during Ramadan. In fact, everything was pandered and catered to the Muslims. And when we see snippets of that leaking into society here, and I'd say it's far more than just snippets within the UK society now, it's almost like there's more of a hullabaloo about the beginning of Ramadan than there is about any other celebration. And I would go as far as to say even Christmas has been toned down. It's not been celebrated to the same extent amongst the organizations within themselves. So generally for Islam, every single time it is kind of brought to the mainstream or brought to the forefront or celebrated or been accommodated for, and they see white people pandering to their needs and their religion, it most definitely will seem like a win. And just to kind of throw in the caveat, the reason for that is essentially because they are in this largest mindset of trying to kind of, have the West pander to Islam. So the West should not be, the greater power here. And Islam flexes its status in tiny little kind of moments like this, whether it's praying in unison on the streets, for example, or whether it's, celebrating breaking your fast outside Buckingham Palace. It's those tiny things in society that are infiltrating ever so slowly, but they are kind of getting the Western mind ready for this almost slight sense of capitulation to Islam.
So the getting the mind ready, the capitulation to Islam, this sounds a little bit similar to the theme of a book by the French novelist Michel Houellebecq. He wrote a book called Submission, where the theme of the book effectively was that institutions over time starts to accommodate themselves toward Islamic practice, cultural norms, and in the end, fully flip. In fact, there's a whole bunch of other stuff in there around an Islamic party that comes along and then joins with left-wing parties to be able to topple the previous government in the next election, and then society changes. I suppose the reason why I bring this up is, and this question's probably coming a little bit sooner than expected, but depending on who you speak to on the street, and I think it is probably determined by their general worldview, is some will see this not necessarily as an issue. They don't necessarily see there being a direction of travel. This is just what we ought to do in a multi-ethnic, multicultural, multi-religious society. For others, it's the direction of travel seems like it's moving more and more in one way. And what's the natural end point of this? And so I think from your perspective, what does the future of a multi-ethnic, multi-religious Britain doing what it's doing with regards to the institutional inclination towards Islam, what does that look like in 10, 20, 30 years on its same on this same trajectory?
Well, it looks very, very bleak if we continue down this path that we're on at this rate that we're going, especially. And honestly, John, when I started my kind of activism, being an outspoken ex-Muslim, it was just because I kind of had read the sources and kind of had this revelation as to what Islam truly wants and what it actually kind of stands for. But I just thought, let me just kind of make some YouTube videos and let me kind of speak about it so other women don't fall into this trap of, essentially being just submissive baby making machines for this political agenda, if you will. And I thought that was just going to be it, inform some people about what Islam is actually like, the true nature of it, the general kind of war manual that the Quran is, if you look at it in that right sense. So then a call to prayer becomes almost like a roll call. And, it gets very dark in that sense. But I thought that's what it would be limited to. And then coming back to the UK and living in London and seeing how quickly things around me had changed. And as you said, like institutions, probably our places of work and the societies we live in, the general mindset surrounding us, so that I'm the strange one around my entire social circle for having the views that I hold. It just seems like such an uphill battle because of how deeply entrenched we are into this mindset that, everything should be in the spirit of tolerance. We should carry on going the way we are and nothing needs to give or nothing needs to change. But I've been listening to commentators on this, and I'm not generally the one to kind of fearmonger, and I tend to be a bit more of an optimist in general, but I'm also very much a realist. And when I hear people who are a lot more well-versed on these topics than myself say that Britain is heading towards civil war, and things to that effect, it really kind of sends a shiver down my spine, because it's not indifferent from what I see around me. And we've seen pockets of this where this flares up, in incidents like Southport and things like that, where these two starkly different communities go head to head, or the government just withhold information for us, albeit Keir Starmer says, for these reasons that were generally valid, which is fair enough. But it is a very, very dark reality if we don't, change something now, and we don't kind of, for example, what America has done since Trump has been elected, and this kind of Trump effect where you can say things that essentially sound like common sense, but were deemed to be so kind of just inflammatory beforehand. And we see the rise of the right across Europe. It just goes to show that people are craving this kind of common sense, saying like, yes, if somebody has come to this country and they have sexually abused little girls and they're not from this country, why on earth should we pay to keep them here? It makes no sense. Saying that would make you, be a social pariah in certain contexts, even though that sounds like a very normal thing to say. So this concept of, accepting tolerance, even if they're intolerant to us, or we have to tread on eggshells because, hey, Islam is just another religion, and we don't go around criticizing people's beliefs for whatever reason that might be, historically or whatever, or we've just gone so soft as a peoples that we're just going to let this unfold the way it's happening. The future looks very dark indeed for the United Kingdom, and I'm not surprised why people are fleeing in their droves or people are having to move. And I just think it's such a sad reality that in the country you call home, if you're having to continuously move or continuously question why you're here or how long you can stay here or the safety of your grandchildren and how they're going to grow up, it's a very it brings a huge sense of despair. Even people like, I think I was listening to Liz Truss talking on the matter, and she said it would take us about 40 to 50 years to undo legally all the damage that's been done and kind of enshrined into law. That is propagating all of these situations that we see play out, whether it's like mass immigration or, people being able to stay in this country due to their right to a family life or what have you. But yeah, it's just, I think it's high time now to act. And I really didn't think conversations on Islam would be as relevant, or let's just say for the sake of people saying not all Muslims, Islamism, or the growing rise of Islamism in the UK would be such a dire threat at the moment.
Well, you mentioned your time as a split growing up, I suppose, in London and then the Middle East. And you can find figures in the Middle East, pretty influential, we'll get onto some of those in a moment, who talk about how they do not tolerate extremists in their society. And in fact, they've commented on what they can see taking place within Europe and say, how is it that you're allowing this to go on in your society? And this isn't really referring specifically to Islamophobia sessions or lights up in West London, but rather the news stories that are generally not pushed out there so much, but we know are happening, whether it's the Rotherham abuse scandals, all of these other things, is what are you doing allowing this to take place? We would have stamped this out a long time ago. And let's stay on the Middle East for a moment, because about 8 years ago, I think, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman, he was, I think, at a future investment conference which Saudi Arabia had put on. And I think he's repeated these comments a bit recently as well, though I couldn't find sources for them. But he was on stage saying that, where is the quote? We want to destroy Islamic extremism and coexist with other religions. And then he goes on to talk about how there ought to be moderation and tolerance. So my question to you is there somewhat of the beginnings of perhaps an Islamic Reformation here, or are words like this to the effect that those saying them are that they're self-serving in some way, they're wanting to seem more moderate and tolerant than they are? Or do you think that they've reached the point within their own imperial ambitions, and I say imperial insofar as United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Saudi, very influential, very moneyed, they sponsor an awful lot of events all over the world, they own lots of property, they in many respects have an Arabian empire, as it were, and there is these historical cycles that say when empires get to a certain level and they become multi-ethnic in some way, they start to liberalize. And we've seen that with Western empires and all the rest of it. Do you think this is something that is genuinely occurring, that we might be seeing the beginning of an Islamic Reformation, a softening of some of those more conquering rhetoric and scriptural reference you've talked about, or is it something else?
Is that in the Middle Eastern context you were asking?
Yeah. Well, yes, in the Middle Eastern context, but I suppose they're also highly influential in Europe too. So I guess you've got Erdogan is always whipping up Turks in Germany with whatever it is that he's focused on. But there's also lots of examples of Saudi or Qatar funding various institutions, centres, all the rest of it here. But if we're seeing some of the rhetoric changing amongst some of the most influential leaders, is that rhetoric to be believed? Is it something that suggests that there could be moderation and tolerance, or is it something else?
Yeah, it's quite a long-winded question, but I'll try and answer it to the best of my ability because there's quite
Guilty
elements. No, that's fine. I'm just trying to give you a succinct answer, but I'm going to be jumping a bit as well, because obviously I think some of these GCCs, the Gulf Cooperation countries, are still very much, but I'm looking at Qatar here when I think of funding channels, especially, and Saudi Arabia back a few decades ago, and how they've already kind of done so much damage when it comes to British institutions, namely universities, and things like that, with the amount of money that they've kind of channeled into these. And we see the rise of Islamic societies, and who have a lot more of a kind of extremist element to them, in terms of their societies aren't just like any other cookery society or reggae society at university. It comes with a huge dose of dawah, which is essentially propaganda for Islam that's seeped into it. So that's kind of always operating in the background. But then I would say that, in my humble opinion, I do think when it comes to countries like Saudi Arabia, which has been so heavily governed in a Wahhabi kind of context, with the ruling class, which will always be ulema, which is the religious kind of authority, which take precedence even over the monarchy, for example. I think it's been ruled like that for so long, and they've realized how in this modern day and age that, that stifles a lot of progress and a lot of money to be made. And if you look at countries like the UAE, they have put their economy and things like that to the forefront, as opposed to exporting Islam per se in that same way. So I do think Mohammed bin Salman, to some degree, does want reformation, because he is quite a young king himself. And, he knows that Saudi Arabia would need to take some of, take a leaf out of Dubai's book, or the UAE's book in general, if it wants to be a key player in the global economy, and if it wants, tourism and things like that, which it will need to rely on, because their oil is not going to last forever. So some people have even gone as far as to say, and I don't know if I buy this, but they've gone as far as to say maybe deep down he is not a Muslim himself, like as in he's kind of turned his back on the faith, but that would never be an outward confession that he'd be able to make. But I think he has taken up this fight against the existing status quo, where it's the ulema who make all the decisions and govern the country. And he wants to push back on that, because he has said some very radical things to the effect of, literally 80% of the Hadith collection, which in Sunni Islam is very much like sacrosanct to part of your beliefs, because it's like essentially Muhammad's life. He said that is not reliable, and it's not something we should follow. And about 20% of that is probably accurate. And then we've got the Quran, and saying something even as radical as that a few years ago would have definitely had the heads roll. But he has said it, and the kingdom is still moving in the direction. I think they've had some concerts now. They're constantly hosting snooker championships and all sorts. And, there's little tweaks there, like, do we allow alcohol? Do we not? And they haven't gone that far yet. But I do think him as a leader, he definitely wants change. And there is a general, growing up in the Middle East, I have seen there is a stark difference when it comes to Arabs like Muslim Arabs in, let's say, for example, the GCC countries versus Muslims in South Asia, and then the British Muslims that we see in this country. The Arab Muslims in the GCC, they tend to be a lot more relaxed when it comes to their religion. I'm talking about your not nominal everyday person, because obviously they live within an Islamic state in general, and there's kind of enough of Islam governing their lives, and they really, really care about economics a lot more. And I think you've got this, again, this is also a problem with Islam, because it puts Arabic and it puts Arabia on such a pedestal that if you don't speak Arabic, first of all, you're not even classed as, truly understanding the religion. That's always up for question. And, you don't really belong to the lands that it originated from, and then it's kind of been imposed on your culture. So what I tend to see is that Pakistani Muslims, like my like ethnicity, Bangladeshi Muslims, Muslims from Malaysian Muslims from all other countries tend that much harder to try and support Islam or kind of, show that they're Muslim. And in the UK, for example, that has really translated into riling up previous generations of British Muslims who actually hold their Muslim identity as their identity first and foremost before being British. And that's kind of the fight that they've chosen to fight, whether it's in whatever's happening geopolitically at the time. We need to take a stand, and we take a stand for Islam before we would ever take a stand for this country. And I go as far as to say they almost have a point to prove that they are out to go against the West and show the West why they're so bad and why they're so wrong. And you see this with, like, casual British Muslim scholars who go on platforms and say, yes, we are at war with the West, or we do absolutely hate Christians and Jews because that's what our book says, and we will continue to do so. And you've got figures like Majid Nawaz who come out and act as if he's all reformed and he understands the extremist mind. But, questions can be raised as to, has that really taken hold, or is he still kind of got the exact, battle that he's fighting? But it's the whole concept of taqiyya in Islam as well, that you can pretty much do anything to push forward Islam's goals, regardless of what you have to say to get there. So I do think the way Islam kind of manifests itself amongst non-Arab Muslims in a Western context is very different from how Islam manifests itself with Arabs within Arab countries. But yeah, sorry, I hope that answered your question.
It does, and it's a good point to bring up the different approaches to the Islamic faith depending on where you're from geographically, because I know Rakib Ehsan, one of our own British Muslim commentators, academics, he's a practicing Muslim. He is very proud to be British. I've had him on the podcast. He often complains about the rising influence of Islam in everyday life, and says he would prefer to live in the country that promotes and is more open about its Christian heritage instead of suppressing it. And following the Rotherham, or at least a resurfacing of the great scandal, which we call the Rotherham scandal, but it hit 50 different towns and cities in which there have been thousands, tens of thousands of girls raped, underage and otherwise, around the country by what have been referred to as grooming gangs, and then those who've sought to break that illusion, I suppose, or rather vague term, call it Pakistani Muslim rape gangs, is what you hear the likes of Matt Goodwin and others saying. And Rakib, who is of Bengali origin and lives in Luton today, has written some pieces saying, well, we can't just focus even on that country, because there are specific areas of the country which are known to be very different in how they approach both their faith and their community relations than others. And so actually, I think he was trying to make the point that when we're thinking about immigration from Muslim countries, or indeed thinking about the issues that we might see with Islam, or he was making a broader point, just more broadly with immigration, that you actually need to get very, very specific with regards to the area of a country that they might be from, because that you can probably predict there are going to be issues there. I don't really know whether an immigration policy like that in Britain will ever come about, given our current approach to immigration. But I suppose you've mentioned that Majid Nawaz has acted as though he's a reformed character. You've brought up taqiyya, which is this idea of advancing Islam through by any means necessary, and that can be deception. You have been quite outspoken, I would say, on Muslim Voices within Britain and more broadly. And I think, and I'm paraphrasing, so you can put me right if it's misquoting, but I know you have said that unless someone has disavowed their Muslim faith, it's very hard to take what they say at face value because of those theological tenets like taqiyya, and also because they are duty bound to advance Islam. So I suppose the reason why I brought up some of those British Muslim voices is, what do you think that means for the public conversation amongst Muslims and non-Muslims? Where do people go to find their information and to engage in good faith about this stuff? Have you got advice?
This is a really, really tough one, John, because like, I'm sure, as you mentioned, I'm sure there are genuinely, and I can speak for my own family here as well, there are genuine British Muslims who are really able to kind of put a lot of what Islam says aside, in terms of, and generally even willfully ignorant of what it commands and what it tells you to do. And they're able to kind of balance this sense of being British and loving the country that they're a part of and that they live in, and, essentially a country that they call home. And they're able to kind of charter that path very, very well. And I've got no qualms with British Muslims who are able to do that. And they have essentially taken Islam to be this personal religion, just the way that other people would have any personal belief system. They choose to pray behind closed doors or fast or attend mosque or what have you. But my concern is, and I do really, I know I kind of put myself out there a little bit when I don't trust British Muslims who claim to be reformed or who claim to, be the spokespeople for anti-terror or counter-terrorism policies, and things like that. Because I genuinely think if somebody like Majid Nawaz, for example, have seen the depths of, what Islamism, just for the sake of argument, and terrorism can do, and where it stems from, and how deep rooted those sources are within the scriptures, it beggars belief that you would continue to see this as some kind of personal religion that you could just adhere to. And that's why Muslims who are in high positions in authority of government as well, actually, if they are trying to back policies that are genuinely going to be at loggerheads with Islam, at some level there would be some kind of mental battle or cognitive dissonance at play, because it is very, very hard for you to kind of adhere to both things at the same time. And I say this because Islam itself, and I was a believing Muslim at some point, and I was a very, very young girl when I left the UK for the first time. But even as a young girl in those few years growing up as a Muslim here in London, I cannot tell you how the way the groupthink behind closed doors or attending mosque classes or generally understanding what it entailed to be a Muslim meant how much you had already internally othered Jews and Christians, and just with a broad paintbrush said, white people in general, despite living in the West. So it does come with a very, very unhealthy dose of hatred for the West. And that's why I kind of brought up taqiyya as well, because I'm not here to say this person's doing taqiyya, this person's guilty of it, this person's not, this person's genuine. But all I'm trying to put out there is that is very much a concept within the religion as well. So if you thought that terrorism was another problem, then you've also got deception, as you rightly said, as another layer of it. So how do we filter out the genuine from the disingenuous? But yeah, so when it comes to like British policies where the country comes first, the security of the country comes first, the security of our little girls comes first, and then you've got perpetrators who come from, as you mentioned, a very specific part of the world, who adhere to a very specific religion, and they are severely overrepresented in that area, and we are not allowed to talk about it. It does beg the question that the people that are protecting them, why are they protecting them? Or, who funds them? Or what is their genuine end goal here? Because you would think that we've come so far as a society that anybody that hears of something as abhorrent as the rape gang scandals across the UK would be absolutely sick to their stomach. And yet we've had to get figures like Elon Musk from across the pond to bring it back to the forefront so people are talking about it. And so I know to a lot of other ex-Muslims, it might seem like, oh, I don't trust anybody until they've left the fold. But to me, if you genuinely, if you have a semblance of humanity and you read those sources and you can put two and two together and you don't need to keep separating and lying to yourself that, oh, not all Muslims or not in the name of my God, when how many terrorists actually, if they're telling us that they're doing this in the name of Allah or they're doing this because their book tells you to do so, then I think at some level we should believe them. And anyone who, continues to stay in that fold and purport to put British national safety and security ahead of that, I do question their motives. And are they playing the long game? And I'm going to make a video today as well on just the gentleman that was put as the head of Ofsted, because a lot of people are, a lot of people are up in arms just by the way he dresses and what he looks like, which is fair enough, but I didn't want to get into that. But to me, it's more about this Star Academies, this trust of schools, if you will, that he's kind of been in charge of for a while, that has been, deemed outstanding. Prior to that, you should look into what those schools were called. And you should look at within that, the Islamic schools for boys, what kind of activities are being done there in terms of cadet, kind of little cadet militias that are being created of these young Muslim men and the subjects that are being taught, which again, I said, I'm not really the one to usually fearmonger and I am an optimist, but it does kind of send a shiver down my spine when you put all these pieces of the puzzle together and then you look at how captured our society is and you look at what Islam's end goal is, which I'm sure, John, you're very much aware of. And it makes me think we need to be extra cautious here in the UK and we need to start backtracking on a lot of what we've let happen.
So the person you bring up for the listeners, if they haven't come across it in the news, is Sir Hamid Patel, who's become the interim director of Ofsted, which is for non-English and non-Brits. This is the institution which reviews the state of the education system, not just the state education system, but the independent schools as well. And I did want to bring this up actually, and there was a Telegraph article about it, and there are actually that many articles haven't been published. I think the Telegraph have published an article, 5 Pillars, which is the Muslim news network, has published an article about him. And then there have been a few, the Times of India outside of the UK, obviously, and the Middle East Eye and others. On Telegraph, I mean, I don't know what the comments are usually like on the Telegraph, but I did not find one positive comment about this. And I don't think anyone is going to be a theology buff, but I think largely you can sense a lament as to the institutions, all the things you've spoken about today at great depth and nuance and understanding about the issues. I don't think that's really in the minds of a lot of people because they haven't gone to that extent. But I think there seems to be an uneasy feeling out there. And I suppose this is probably a good point to bring up the media class's treatment of those who are in leadership positions who are openly religious. And clearly Sir Hamid Patel is. And I wanted to bring up an example of Tim Farron, who is a former Liberal Democrats leader, and he led the Lib Dems into the general election of 2017 up against the political heavyweights of Jeremy Corbyn and Theresa May. And Tim Farron was hounded, I think is probably fair. I don't think I'm emphasizing it here, but you go and do a search for him and the interviews he had leading up to that election, and generally people were going at him because of his religious belief. He's an evangelical Christian, and because the modern political settlement has found itself on the side of abortion, gay and lesbian rights, divorce, is he was repeatedly pushed as to whether his religious beliefs might end up impinging upon that political settlement, and how could he possibly put those he's coming to govern at rest if they think those things are good things, but they know his religious belief doesn't allow it. And I just find it curious, I think is probably the best way of putting it, that how we have treated Christianity in the public sphere for the last few decades including generally just thinking it's something that old fusty people do in a bygone era, and it's better that we don't have it because we should focus on liberty, and that we're all a bit beyond that religion stuff now, is, I think, a paraphrase, but I think broadly where Brits have come to these days. Is I do find it interesting that clearly those who are of a more conservative religious disposition, regardless of the monotheistic faith they follow, Sir Hamid Patel being one of them, is that there doesn't seem to be any public discussion about what his religious belief might mean for governing a secular institution like Ofsted. And indeed, no one asked that question of Sadiq Khan or Hamza Yusuf or whoever else. And I suppose my question to you is do you think, what do you think's behind that? So you have, I suppose, no questions that get put in this direction. Is it that there's a hope that it won't impact? Is there just generally a naivety about how strongly some people hold their beliefs and how that colours every decision they make? What your view, looking into it as someone who's spent time around the issues of Islam in the West, what do you think lies behind the media class's treatment of it, good, bad, or ugly?
I think it's a result of just how over the decades it's become absolutely normal, if you will, and also completely fine to, question Christianity, mock Christianity, say what you will about it. And as you said, have it relegated almost to something that was almost a past thing now done by men of a bygone era. And Islam has just found itself a nice, cushy place in our society where it's been it's taken off this status as a kind of this victim mentality for every follower of the religion, and the religion itself, as they've done well to mesh it in with race as well. So Islamophobia and racism are kind of those are the two fears that people have when they even bring up a concern, and a very valid concern, if I may, about Islam. And years and years of this have led it to kind of have this buffer around it where it's succeeded in its special pleading to kind of be gate-kept and safeguarded. But here's the end result of all of these special protections that we've given Islam over the years. And it is ludicrous to me as an ex-Muslim that, and like I said, I don't want to judge people by their looks or their appearance or what have you. But when you look at Sir Hamid Patel, it is clear that he takes the religion extremely seriously. I mean, as an ex-Muslim, I can tell you that the attire he wears is very much in line with following exactly what they assume the Prophet would have worn in 7th century Arabia. So everything from his beard to his headpiece to the tobe, it is very much the exact commands that you should follow if you're a good Muslim man. And I said, again, this is something that a lot of men or British Muslims showcase here in the West, where it's freezing. It's not really the appropriate way to dress in this country, but yet that's how much you care for your religion that you would outwardly choose to express yourself in that way. And I'm very, very worried in the sense that that's why I was letting you know that I was actually going to make a video specifically on this, because people have just focused on, I can see on Twitter is a very sensationalized platform, and I do understand that. So people were just, having a go at his beard and the way he dresses. But I think, as you rightly mentioned, his beliefs, how are they going to play into managing a secular institution like Ofsted across the board? Because I just looked into it for about 5-10 minutes the other day to see what his previous schools have done where he's been in charge. And it struck me straight away that the first subjects that were kind of struck off as subjects that replaced it were art, music, and PE. And that made complete sense to me as an ex-Muslim, because, Islam loads the mixing of men and women to PE, boys and girls, and wearing shorts and, just playing skin in Islamic tradition and what have you, but music and art as well are two things that are very much not a thing in Islam. It robs society of that, which I think is just absolutely one of the saddest things in human history. But there you have it. And so to have a man like him at the helm of that and not giving credence to, I think we're a society that very much, recognizes the value of things like art and music. And we truly appreciate that. And we've understood its place in human society and development in general. But how on earth do you think a man with such stringent beliefs, they're not going to flow over into the organization of Ofsted? It makes no sense to me. And I think people like yourself and myself, it's very much our duty to have those questions, which are very valid, about how do you expect somebody to marry those two things together.
Yeah, and I think in that Telegraph article as well, some of the examples of what Sir Hamid Patel has personally instructed at the schools he's looked after as chief executive of the Star Academies. I think one of them was making sure that the girls at girls' schools, not all of them, but one of them, were to wear their hijab out of school as well, which probably seems slightly innocuous to some listeners. Also, not to bring anything in like lunchboxes or whatever that has un-Islamic images on them, like pop stars. I think the other one was, I've forgotten his name, but he has a YouTube channel with 5 million watchers, and apparently he was heavily requested by the pupils to come in to give a talk. And I think it was the Campaign Against Anti-Semitism had done a bit of digging on this chap and found out that he had been found using language like, we need to terminate the Jews, and referring to Jews and Christians as pigs. So I think just Jews as pigs, actually. So not wanting to do the "you're guilty by association" card, because even as someone who has a very milquetoast podcast and speaks to people about all manner of issues, is those who lean progressive will typically look at me and go, "Why are you speaking to that person? Why are you speaking about this thing?" As though it's beyond the pale. So I don't want to apply that to them. But I think the questions being, if these are the things that you are platforming, I suppose, is how is it that you don't let that bleed over into the rest of it? And I suppose it's going to be an unfolding story. Nuriyah, just before we land into the end zone of the main part of the show, I did want to finish on probably a slightly lighter note, which is your Twitter account can be excellent for your trips out with the English cricket team, or at least the away fans. You are a proud member of the Barmy Army, as they're called, and sometimes there are just videos of you with them whilst they're trumpeting Jerusalem, William Blake's poem and the great Anglican hymn. And I wonder, as someone who you're born in London to a Muslim family, you spent some time in the Middle East, you clearly care about Britishness, Englishness, and some of the traits of the country and its peoples. Do you think a place like the English away end, or even just Lords or whatever, is one of the last readouts of where Englishness can be properly expressed in some way? And I suppose as a follow-up question to that, you're clearly someone who would be referred to as integrated, as someone from a recent immigrant background. What do these symbols of Englishness mean to you? And do you think that the place in which you can be English and have expressions of Englishness has shrunk markedly, and we need to hold on to them?
I think absolutely we need to hold on to them, and that really is my hope. And it's sad to say, but having left Islam, I was able to kind of embrace them more wholeheartedly. That's why I alluded earlier to, there's always going to be some inner conflict if you come from a religion that tells you that the religion is above everything else, and especially let alone you being at war with the very place you live in. But thankfully, my family, my immediate family as well, like my parents, they showed me these elements of what it means to be British, and they kind of set the tone in terms of my dad introduced me to cricket on the green and how that's quintessentially English, and a typical Sunday watching a test match and with a pint in your hand, or like Wimbledon or kind of the Magna Carta, and he took us to just hotspots in the UK, which really enshrined a sense of, wow, this is what English history needs to celebrate, or this is why you should be proud to belong to a country that has changed the world for the better. And I think a lot of us, even Muslims, don't say it, but when they go abroad, there are probably moments when they internalize, be like, oh, this is why I'm so grateful to be British, or this is what it means to be British, when, they compare themselves respectively to other things that might be going on around them. But no, absolutely. I think we don't have many days where we celebrate our past, or, we don't have Independence Days per se. We've got to such a place now where holding up the Union Jack flag can just have really negative connotations. Whereas holding up the flag for Gaza, you'd get a crowd cheering behind you. And I think that's a very, that's a very strange state of affairs. I think I'm glad actually I was here. I heard on the news the other day that they were starting now I think they were celebrating women in war and their roles, and anybody can kind of submit anybody from their family history who has taken part in it, and we're going to now kind of try and immortalize these things, and describing, for example, Britain's role in World War II, for example, and how important that was just for us to even be able to sit here and have this conversation today. John, but a lot of the younger generations don't understand that, and teaching them the importance of that. And I see why that's true. If you've never gone through the education system and been told that that's something to revere or something to be proud of, I specifically chose history as a subject because I was generally interested in it. But had I not understood the threat from, fascism and the Nazis, and how close we were, to that all unfolding in Britain, and us speaking German here today, and the university I went to being the headquarters, it kind of really made it hit home to me that we could have been in a completely different situation. But the younger generation are very much immune to this, and they've grown up in a world where, England bad, brown people good, and we're trying to set the kind of status quo right on that, because we've been downtrodden for so long, and anything that happens to the Great Britain or English people or white people in general is just, oh, tough luck, because look what they did to us in X, Y, and Z countries, or, however many years ago. And I think that's a very, very dangerous way to look at the world. And that's why we talked about institutions earlier, but I think our institutions are guilty of perpetuating this kind of mindset. So we do need to, I think this is like the last memorial services where we had veterans that are still with us, because by the time it comes around next year, there's probably going to be 0 living war veterans. And I think that's extremely, it gives you goosebumps to even talk about it, because that will just be lost to history, essentially, if we don't immortalize these things now. And I mean, this is when, as you said, if you can integrate like that, if you can focus on things that make this country great and why you're proud to be a part of it, it becomes really, really kind of like you celebrate things that are genuinely British, and you enjoy them for what they are, instead of constantly, coming up against them or begrudgingly having to, accept that they are fantastic, which they are. And sorry, just
let's not make patriotism great again. Go on, say that again.
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry, I was just going to also say, it's wild to me, having lived in places like the UAE, where they are able to contain what they consider extremist elements who go against, the general, their country or what have you, but they're all within the Islamic fold. And if they know how to seed out terrorist organizations, or they know how to ban them or recognize them before Britain, then we seriously have a problem here. So if you've got countries like the UAE banning elements of, let's say, the Muslim Brotherhood or charities that they deem to be receiving terrorist funds. And we've got those same charities plastering their ads across TfL, Transport for London, and our tube networks. It just says to me, like, we really need to do some introspection.
Well, I'm not going to hold my breath because I do want to live beyond the next 5 minutes, and that's if I could even hold it that long. One last question, which I ask all of my guests, and then we will finish with a couple of questions for paying Substack subscribers. So the last question, Nuriyah, and we've certainly touched on a few of your big mind changes throughout life, but what have you changed your mind on during the course of your life that you once thought was set in stone, it's unquestionable, it's an absolute, and what was it that made you think differently?
Obviously, the glaringly obvious one is obviously my belief in Islam, and that's all-encompassing. So I think that would be the main one in terms of that, because it seeps into politics. And sorry, John, can you repeat what was the second part of the question?
What was the trigger for making you think differently on that? So what led to your apostasy, I suppose?
Oh, the trigger was essentially a life scenario, trying as a Muslim woman to file for a divorce and get out of a relationship that I no longer wanted to be in. But I would say the biggest reason is reading, honestly, reading, educating myself. And I would implore everybody, and I always say the irony, John, is that a lot of people say the first words that were ever the first words that were ever uttered by Angel Gabriel to the alleged Prophet Muhammad himself was to read. And I just say, well, I wish that Muslims take that advice and read, because honestly, it is a fast track out of there if you trust what you are reading. But that's probably the main thing I've changed my mind. And I've changed my mind on a lot of other things since then, obviously, when it comes to, little things like sort of England's role in the empire, things like that, racism, a lot of extremely progressive views that were instilled in me from the extremely progressive university I unfortunately attended. There was a lot of unlearning to be done there. But yeah, I think those were the two main things.
Well, it's been an absolute pleasure to speak to you so far, and I'm sure everyone who is non-paying subscribes to Substack get the hint, guys. I hope you've enjoyed this portion of the show. Before we let you go, let's give everyone the chance to know where they can find you online, and is there anything that we can expect from you? Are you working on anything that you can share with us?
Well, you can find me on YouTube. I have a channel called Holy Humanist, where it's predominantly focused on my journey, leaving Islam, the reasons I left it, the flaws in Islam, and with a slight focus on kind of women's rights, or as I say, the lack thereof within Islam. So yeah, there's the YouTube channel, and on Twitter, X, formerly Twitter, I can't get used to X. It's at Nuriyah K. And yes, I apologize to everybody that does follow me. I'm not as active as I would like to be, but I do work full time. So yeah, watch the space. As I mentioned to John earlier, I will be making a video about the Ofsted situation. Grateful. I think he's just the interim. I think, right, he's just there for the interim. I think So I'm just going to give my thoughts on that anyway. I know he's not going to be a permanent member of Ofsted unless he does a stellar job. But so anytime there is something that pops up in terms of the news cycle, or something that I think is extremely alarming, I will try my best to comment on it, either through a small video or a Twitter post at the very minimum. So yeah, watch this space.
Well, Nuriyah, all the best with all the work you do on the side of your day job, and it's been an absolute pleasure to be able to get the chance to speak to you. Thanks for coming on. Take good care, and all the best for your endeavours.
Thank you so much, John. It's been an absolute pleasure, and thank you for the invite.
You're very welcome. Anytime. I hope we can talk again in the future. To keep up to date with all that I am doing, please subscribe to the Thinking Class YouTube channel at Thinking Class, and follow me on X at Thinking Classes. Thinking Class seeks to understand the civilizational issues we face and why what our leaders do in response matters. Here, I seek to explore the ideas, values, and culture that made our civilization, those that are unmaking it, and how leaders at our public and private institutions should respond. Engage with me on YouTube or X, or write to me at thinkingclasspod@gmail.com to tell me who you want me to speak to and what topics are important to you. I look forward to seeing you there and for joining me on this journey.